Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Aaron Blade, and I am the editor, creator, and producer of what you're watching right now, Blade Talk. If you are new here, welcome, and you found this presentation helpful and informative, do me a huge favor and hit that like button. Do me an even greater favor and subscribe to my channel. I always appreciate all the support that I am given. So in today's presentation, I'm going to go over 10 lies that Christianity was built on. So without further ado, if you're interested, let's hit that intro and let's begin. Okay, so I'm going to spare you the suspense and let's jump right in. Christianity was not born from truth. It was constructed from 10 of the most audacious lies ever told. And the first begins with a myth so cunning it fooled billions for centuries. The claim that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. You've probably heard the story your entire life that Joseph and Mary had to travel to Bethlehem for a Roman census, and as a result, Jesus was born there, conveniently fulfilling the prophecy in the Hebrew scriptures. But here's the problem. There is no historical record of any Roman census requiring people to return to their ancestral homeland. That idea is not just unusual, it is unprecedented, illogical, and entirely inconsistent with how Roman census actually worked. Romans taxed and counted people where they lived, not where their ancestors once lived 1,000 years earlier. So why invent such a bizarre premise? Because the Hebrew prophecy in the book of Micah said the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. That prophecy was well known by first century Jews and early Christian authors. But if Jesus was from Nazareth, as everyone seemed to agree, then the story needed to be twisted to match the prophecy. And that is exactly what the Gospels of Matthew and Luke attempted to do, each fabricating different and conflicting stories to get Mary to Bethlehem. But ask yourself this. If Jesus was really born in Bethlehem, why do the earliest gospel, Mark, and even Paul, the earliest Christian writer, never mention it? Paul, writing 20 years after Jesus supposedly lived, never says a word about Bethlehem. He never says Jesus was born of a virgin either. That entire narrative was added later. That brings us to lie number 2, the fabricated genealogies of Jesus. The Gospel of Matthew gives a genealogy that runs through King David's son Solomon, while Luke gives an entirely different one through King David's son Nathan. Not only that, but they contradict each other on virtually every generation between David and Jesus. Some defenders say one genealogy is for Mary, the other for Joseph, but the texts both clearly state they are for Joseph. And here lies the core contradiction. If Jesus was born of a virgin, then Joseph's lineage would be meaningless to Jesus' divine bloodline. Yet the evangelists go to great lengths to prove Joseph was descended from King David, as if that somehow made Jesus the legal heir. But if Jesus had no biological father, he could not inherit anything from Joseph. This theological contradiction was so messy, it should have unraveled the entire narrative. And yet, instead of asking hard questions, most people just absorb the tale without ever noticing how completely illogical it was. But it gets worse, because lie number 3 is perhaps the most pivotal of all: the virgin birth itself. Christians have been told for centuries that Isaiah prophesied a virgin would give birth to the Messiah. But that is a mistranslation. The Hebrew word in Isaiah is Alma, which simply means young woman, not virgin. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek centuries later, the version called the Septuagint, the word was incorrectly translated as pathos, which can mean virgin. And that mistranslation, that single word error, was used as the foundation for one of the most defining doctrines in all of Christianity. Think about that. A mistranslation of a single word was used to invent the virgin birth of Jesus, a concept so central to the Christian faith that questioning it is considered heresy in many circles. And yet, the original Hebrew text never said anything about a virgin. What does it mean when the most sacred miracle of Jesus' origin story, the claim that his mother was a virgin, is built on history, not on biology, not even on prophecy, but on a translator's error? And why did the Gospel of Mark, the earliest gospel written, never mention a virgin birth at all? Because it had not been invented yet. That's right. The earliest gospel authors never even claimed Jesus was born of a virgin. That story appears only in Matthew and Luke, which were written decades later, and they do not even agree on the details. Matthew says Joseph wanted a divorce from Mary quietly. Luke says he never doubted her at all. These are not just harmless inconsistencies. These are contradictions that undermine the credibility of the most critical claims in the entire faith. Ask yourself, would the truth need so much creative editing? Would the truth need to contradict itself at every turn? Would the truth need to fabricate a travel scenario, invent a census, mistranslate a prophecy, and splice together two irreconcilable genealogies just to make the pieces fit? Or is it more likely that these were the efforts of storytellers trying to make their character fulfill ancient expectations, retrofitting their theology into the mold of Jewish messianic prophecy to win over skeptical converts? And if the earliest Christians were already this willing to invent, what else were they capable of creating later on? What began as a movement of apocalyptic preachers evolved into a full-blown religion with carefully curated stories and doctrines. But the lies that built Christianity did not stop at the birth of Jesus. They only got more dramatic from there. If the foundation is false, how strong can the structure truly be? We have only just begun uncovering the historical fabrications that propped up the greatest story ever told. The virgin birth, the genealogies, and the journey to Bethlehem are not sacred facts. They are literary tools, narrative inventions, and theological traps designed to deceive the masses and solidify control. You were not told these stories so you could ask questions. You were told them so you would stop thinking. But today, we break that spell. And once you see how it started, you will never be able to unsee what comes next. Because these are just the first 3 lies in a web of 10. And what follows will shake the very core of Christian history. If the birth story was already a calculated lie, then what about the rest of Jesus' life? Why does it vanish from history? Lie number 4 is perhaps the most deafening silence in the entire historical record. The idea that Jesus, this miracle performing, crowd drawing, temple flipping figure who allegedly attracted thousands and shook the foundation of Jewish and Roman power, left behind no contemporary historical trace whatsoever. Not one word, not one mention, Not a single sentence written during his lifetime by anyone. Not a Roman, not a Greek, not even a Jew, despite the fact that Israel was under constant surveillance, record keeping, and documentation by multiple imperial and religious authorities. Think about that for a moment. We have detailed records about obscure peasant uprisings, minor Jewish prophets, and political prisoners from the first century, but nothing about a man who supposedly fed 5,000 people with a few loaves of bread and raised the dead in public view. How can that be? Because it never happened. The Jesus described in the Gospels is not just a figure with no footprint, he is a literary ghost. Think about it. Jesus was a carpenter, yet none of his tables or anything that he worked on survived. You would think that if a Jewish carpenter became famous, his works and the tables and desks that he created would still be around and even be more valuable today. But that's not the case. This leads us directly into lie number 5, the myth of the 500 witnesses. In Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, written around the year 55, he makes a bold claim that over 500 people saw the resurrected Jesus. That sounds impressive, even definitive. But who are they? Where are their names? Where are their accounts? Why did no one write down this stunning moment in history besides Paul? And even he gives no details whatsoever. No location, no dates, no cross-references, no independent confirmations. It is a phantom crowd. And worse yet, the Gospels, written after Paul, never mentioned this massive event. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all of whom supposedly had access to the core stories of Jesus' life, never echo Paul's claim about 500 people witnessing the resurrection. How do you explain that? You can't, unless the event never occurred. And Paul made it up to bolster the new religion he was inventing. Let that sink in. The earliest claim of the resurrection is made by a man who never met Jesus in his life, who was not present at the crucifixion, and whose version of Jesus was formed entirely through visions and mystical experiences, not real-world events. Now comes lie number 6, and is the one the entire religion hinges on: the resurrection itself. The idea that Jesus died, was buried in a tomb, and then rose 3 days later has been repeated so often it feels unquestionable. But the truth is, the empty tomb story does not appear in the earliest Christian writings. Paul again says nothing about a tomb at all. He says Jesus was buried, but not where, not how, not in what. The idea of a sealed tomb guarded by Romans only appears decades later in the Gospel of Matthew and others, and each of them contradict the others. Mark, the earliest gospel, ends with women discovering the tomb and running away in fear, telling no one. That was it. No appearances, no miracles, just silence. Later, scribes added verses to Mark to force a resurrection appearance into the text. Yes, the earliest ending of Mark had to be modified to fit the rising doctrine. That is how desperate the early church was to patch the holes. Matthew adds guards to the tomb. Luke includes a dramatic walk to Emmaus, and John has Jesus appear to disciples multiple times, even letting Thomas touch his wounds. But none of these accounts agree. They are literary expansions, not historical records. Ask yourself, why would the single most important event in Christian theology, the resurrection, not be documented in a single independent historical source? Not one Roman report, not one temple record, not one non Christian account. Why? Because the resurrection was never a historical event. It was a theological idea, a symbol of triumph over death, slowly written into the fabric of a religion that needed a climax. And if the resurrection is a lie, then what are we left with? A man whose life is undocumented, whose teachings were filtered through generations of editors, whose miracles left no trace, and whose death was rewritten a dozen different ways depending on the audience. What does that say about the truth behind the story? Consider this. Every religion in history has stories of gods dying and coming back. Osiris in Egypt, Dionysus in Greece, Mithras in Persia. All of them had followers, rituals, and resurrection tales. Christianity was not the first to invent a dying and rising God. It was simply the one that survived through empire. And that survival depended on crafting narratives that could compete with and surpass the old myths. So the writers of the New Testament borrowed, repurposed, and restructured ancient ideas, stamping them with a Jewish name and Roman polish. That is how you create a religion that lasts. Not by telling the truth, but by constructing a myth powerful enough to replace older ones. And the empty tomb was the keystone of that myth. But if the tomb was never real, then the resurrection was never real. And if the resurrection was never real, then Christianity has no foundation. That is not just controversial, it is catastrophic for everything believers have been taught to put their trust in. Do not mistake the power of the story for the truth of history. A story can move hearts, change lives, even build civilizations, but it can also deceive. And when that story is repeated over and over in every church, every Bible class, every holiday sermon, it becomes not just a tale, it becomes a prison of belief. You were told Jesus rose because it gave you hope, but the people who wrote those stories did it because it gave them power. And that power was never meant to free you, it was meant to control you. What would happen if that control collapsed? What would society look like if the most sacred event in Western religious tradition turned out to be nothing but smoke and scripture? We are only halfway through, and already the lies are unraveling faster than anyone wants to admit. The next lies are even more devastating. If the resurrection never happened, then why did so many people believe it? Why were the Gospels written at all? Why do they tell us the same story, more or less, if it was all just made up? That brings us to lie number 7, the myth that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. For most Christians over the age of 50, the idea that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John personally knew Jesus, or at least knew people who did, has been drilled in so deep it feels like a fact. But it is not. It is a lie. None of the Gospels are signed. None of them claim authorship in their original versions. The names were added later by church tradition decades after the texts were first circulated. That means no one really knows who wrote the Gospels, and worse, whoever did write them was not there. Biblical scholars across the spectrum from conservative to secular agree that the Gospels were written between 40 and 70 years after the events they describe. That is two full generations of telephone game storytelling, political reinterpretation, and theological reshaping. And there's more. The Gospel of Mark, believed to be the first written, does not even include a full resurrection narrative in its earliest manuscripts. The original ending of Mark stops at chapter 16, verse number 8, with the women fleeing the empty tomb and telling no one what they saw. No risen Jesus, no appearances, no instructions. That was the end. It was only later scribes who added the rest, splicing in resurrection scenes borrowed from the other Gospels. Does that sound like eyewitness testimony? Or does it sound like literary editing designed to align the narrative with evolving doctrine? Now consider this. If Matthew and Luke had access to Mark, as many scholars believe, why do they contradict Mark and each other so often? One says Jesus' first sermon was on a mountaintop. The other says it was on a plain. One says Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great. The other says during the census of Quirinius, which occurred 10 years later. One says Jesus' last words were, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Another says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Yet another says, "It is finished." How can the most sacred moment in Christian history, Jesus' final breath, have three completely different versions, all allegedly remembered by faithful followers? The answer is simple. They were not remembered. They were invented, crafted, tailored to fit different audiences. Matthew writes for Jews, so he emphasizes prophecy fulfillment. Luke writes for Gentiles, so he softens Jewish law and adds more compassion. John writes last, and his Jesus sounds like a cosmic being rather than a man. The difference is not just stylistic, it is theological. Jesus evolves from a humble preacher in Mark to a God walking among men in John. That is not eyewitness memory, that is mythological inflation. And this brings us to lie number 8. The contradictions in the passion narratives. If Jesus' trial and crucifixion were real historical events, they should be the most consistent accounts in the Bible. But they are not. Each gospel disagrees on major details. In Matthew, Judas throws the silver back and hangs himself. In Acts, written by the same author as Luke, Judas buys a field and falls headlong, spilling his intestines. In one version, the two thieves crucified with Jesus both mock him. In another, one repents and goes to paradise. The timeline of the crucifixion also shifts. John says Jesus was crucified the day before Passover. The others say it was on Passover itself. These are not small differences. They are timelining contradictions that destroy any claim of factual reliability. Would eyewitnesses contradict each other on something as enormous as the hour their teacher died? Would they forget which day it happened, or who was there, or what was said in his final breath? Of course not. But anonymous authors writing decades later for different communities might very well insert their own versions of the story to make theological points. And that is exactly what we see. These are not historical records. They are religious propaganda. And once you understand that, the house of cards begins to collapse, because the cross was not just an execution. It was a symbol, and symbols can be reshaped, remixed, and reused to control the emotions of an audience. Ask yourself this: why does Jesus in John carry his own cross proudly, while in others he stumbles and needs help? Why does John emphasize Jesus' divinity at the cross while Mark focuses on his humanity and abandonment? These are not accidental discrepancies. They are deliberate rewrites layered onto the story to match evolving dogmas. The Jesus of John is not the same as the Jesus of Mark. They are two different characters shaped by different theological needs. And that should terrify anyone who ever believed these stories were inspired by the same God. Because a divine truth does not need revision. A divine truth does not change shape based on who's listening. A divine truth does not contradict itself across four versions, but a man-made myth does over and over again. If you are feeling the weight of these contradictions, it is because you are finally seeing what so many were never allowed to examine. That the passion story, the trial, the betrayal, the crucifixion, and even the resurrection was never preserved as a sacred record. It was rewritten, edited, and customized to keep believers loyal and afraid to ask questions. If this does not disturb you, read those chapters again side by side. Look for the differences. Count how many timelines break. Watch how the words change, the actions shift, the characters disappear or transform. This is not how history behaves. This is how fiction grows. Each edit, each contradiction, each retelling was another layer of the lie. And beneath all of it lies a truth so dangerous, so undeniable, that the churches dare not speak of it. The story of Jesus was never about truth. It was about control. And now that you've seen it, you can't unsee it. If the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus were rewritten, reshaped, and riddled with contradictions, then what kept the myth alive long enough to become an empire-spanning religion? Well, that leads us into lie number 9. The myth of the early Christian martyrs. You've probably heard that the earliest followers of Jesus were so convinced of his resurrection, so unwavering in their faith, that they were willing to face torture, lions, fire, and crucifixion rather than deny their beliefs. That emotional image of brave men and women dying for Jesus has been used for centuries to validate the faith. After all, one common question is, who would die for a lie? But that question only holds weight if the stories are true, and they are not. Most of the martyrdom narratives that circulate today were written long after the events they supposedly describe. Take the tale of Peter being crucified upside down in Rome. There is no contemporary record of this. It appears only in apocryphal texts written more than a century later. The same goes for the story of Paul's beheading, the burning of Christians as torches by Nero, or the mass executions in arenas. These are tales passed down through generations of religious storytellers, not documented historical facts. And here's the kicker. Even the earliest Christian texts show no uniform picture of persecution. In fact, some early Christian writings like Datish and the letters of Ignatius indicate that Christian communities often lived peacefully and integrated with their pagan neighbors. So why fabricate martyrdom? Because it is the most powerful tool of manipulation. If you can convince people that your movement is built on the blood of heroes and its truth is so sacred it costs lives, then any challenge to that narrative becomes sacrilege. It turns the belief into a battlefield and doubt into treason. But no religion has ever flourished because of how many people died for it. Religions flourish because of how well they serve power. And that brings us to lie number 10, the final and perhaps most sinister fabrication. The idea that Christianity spread organically through grassroots evangelism and divine favor. The truth is far darker. Christianity did not conquer the world through miracles or martyrdom. It did so through imperial force, political alliances, and calculated rebranding. The Roman Empire, once a brutal enemy of Christians, became its greatest ally, not because of spiritual awakening, but because of political opportunity. You see, in the 4th century, especially the early 4th century, Emperor Constantine faced a fractured empire teetering on collapse. Paganism was no longer unifying. The gods of Rome were too many, too weak, and too divided. He needed a single symbol, a central narrative, something that could unite millions across diverse lands. Christianity, with its promise of eternal order, moral authority, and already growing network of bishops and infrastructure, offered the perfect solution. So Constantine adopted the cross not out of faith, but out of strategy. It's interesting to note that Emperor Constantine, though he made Christianity the official religion of Rome, he himself never did a Christian thing in his life. As a matter of fact, he wasn't even baptized until the end of his life. He did nothing Christian at all. He summoned the Council of Nicaea, standardized doctrine, and paved the way for the Nicene Creed, not to preserve truth, but to end theological infighting that threatened political stability. He merged state and church, giving the bishops imperial backing and in return receiving divine legitimacy, and from that moment on, Christianity stopped being a movement of the poor and became a tool of emperors. Pagan temples were stripped and rebuilt as churches. Heretics were hunted. The Jesus of love and peace was replaced with the Christ of conquest and empire. And for the next 1,000 years, Christianity would expand not by grace, but by sword. Every step forward was accompanied by violence, coercion, or forced conversions. From the Crusades to the Inquisition, from the forced baptisms of the indigenous peoples to the burning of libraries and temples, the so-called faith of the martyrs became the machinery of oppression. And what about the texts themselves? The Bible that so many revere as the pure Word of God, that too was reshaped under empire. Books were chosen, others rejected. Gospels that presented alternative views of Jesus, like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Mary, were labeled heretical and destroyed. Councils of men motivated by politics and doctrine decided which texts would define eternity. And once that canon was locked, any deviation became punishable. That was not a religion rising on truth. It was a regime rising on narrative. Christianity became the Roman Empire in a robe, claiming heavenly authority while enforcing earthly dominance. And we are still living in the shadow of that power today. Every church built on stolen land, every cross raised above silenced traditions, every verse quoted to justify war, slavery, or discrimination. It all traces back to a time when myth was weaponized by empire. So ask yourself this: if Jesus preached humility, why did his followers build palaces of gold? If he called for peace, why did they wage holy wars? If he rejected power, why did they crown popes like kings? The answer is chilling, because the Jesus who walked in sandals and healed the sick was not the Jesus who built Christianity. That Jesus was edited out, reshaped, and rebranded to fit the needs of emperors, popes, and kings. And what we are left with is not the faith of Christ, but the faith of Constantine. The 10 lies that built Christianity were not innocent mistakes, they were deliberate strategies. Each one added brick to the structure of belief. From the false birth story to the myth of martyrdom, from the forged gospels to the imperial takeover, it was never about truth. It was always about power. You are not just hearing a different version of history, you are witnessing the collapse of a story that controlled the world for over 2,000 years. So now that all 10 lies have been exposed, the false birthplace, the mistranslated virgin prophecy, the contradictory genealogies, the silence of history, the phantom witnesses, the inconsistent resurrection stories, the anonymous gospel authors, the incompatible crucifixion accounts, the myth of martyrdom, and the imperial hijacking of the faith, what are we really left with? A religion that claims to be built on divine truth, yet at every foundational level is tangled in human fabrication, historical distortion, and political agenda. And here is the deepest and most painful truth of all: it worked. For nearly 2,000 years, these lies were not just accepted, they were celebrated. They became untouchable pillars of culture, morality, and identity. People were born into these stories, raised under them, judged by them, and sent to war for them. These are not small fabrications. These were global constructions that shaped the fate of empires and the minds of billions. And even now, in the age of information, most people still have no idea how thoroughly manipulated the history of Christianity actually is. They still think that Jesus was born in Bethlehem because of a Roman census that never happened. They still believe the Gospels were written by men who followed Jesus, not anonymous scribes shaping doctrine decades later. They still picture a divine resurrection when the earliest and most reliable texts show no such scene. They still revere saints and martyrs whose deaths were invented, whose heroism was fabricated to strengthen the illusion of divine favor. And above all, they still believe that Christianity spread because it was true, not because it was weaponized by emperors who saw in it the perfect vehicle for social control. But the more you look, the more undeniable it becomes. Every major point in the story, the birth, the death, the resurrection, the spread, is wrapped in contradiction, silence, or fraud. And here is a question that must be asked: if Jesus had never existed, would anything about this religion look different? Would the doctrines change? Would the holidays vanish? Would the churches empty? The frightening answer is no, because Christianity as it exists today does not depend on the man, it depends on the myth. The historical Jesus, if he ever lived at all, has been drowned in the flood of imperial rewriting, theological censorship, and manufactured miracles. The version of Christianity that Christians worship today is not the peasant from Galilee. It is a construct assembled from fragments of older religions, rewritten by political councils, and polished over centuries into something unrecognizable. And that construct has been used to justify crusades, inquisitions, colonizations, and genocide. It has been used to control sexuality, suppress science, manipulate governments, and silence dissent. That is not the legacy of a truth. That is the legacy of an empire disguised as faith. And here's the final reflection. If these 10 lies built Christianity, what does it say about the institutions still standing on them? What does it mean for the billions of people whose entire worldview is rooted in a narrative so thoroughly falsified? What does it mean for you? Maybe you feel shaken. Maybe you feel angry. Or maybe for the first time you feel free. Because when you tear down a lie, what you are left with is space for truth. Real truth. Not the kind that needs to be enforced by fear, dogma, or tradition. The kind that invites questions. The kind that welcomes doubt. The kind that grows. And if you have stayed with me through every one of these revelations, then you already know this is not just about Christianity. It is about power. It is about how easily people are controlled when they are handed a sacred story and told never to question it. It is about how myths become prisons and how truth, real, raw, uncomfortable truth, is the only key that can open the door. So here is that key. Use it. Re-examine everything you were told. Look at the dates. Read the early texts. Trace the contradictions. Watch how theology was rewritten to match empire. And then decide for yourself. Do you want to keep living in the shadow of a lie? Or do you want to step into the light of what is real? Because this is not the end of the story. It is only the beginning of a new one. One where history is not owned by religion. One where you get to choose what you believe. So I hope you learned something in this presentation. My goal is not to tear down Christianity. My goal as a Jew is to prevent other people from worshiping idols. That's what I want for humanity. As I go through Christianity, Christian texts, such as the New Testament, I see things hidden beneath the words. I see anti-Semitism. And as I've always stated, my goal on this channel is to decrease anti-Semitism. And I see it so prevalent in the New Testament and in the Quran. Walk up to your Christian friend and ask them a simple question. Who killed Jesus? Most will say Jews. And even the ones that say that the Romans killed Jesus, it was only because the Jews forced their hand. Beneath the teachings of love your neighbor and whatnot that already existed in the Torah. Lies, hidden anti Semitic remarks towards Jews. Christianity spells the destruction of my people, and that I don't want. When you have Jews portrayed in a certain light in the New Testament, every question that Jesus is asked by a Jew is met with an insult. Jesus says, "You evil, adulterous generation." Jesus says, "Your father is Satan." And if you read the book of Revelations, it goes on to say the synagogue of Satan, which most anti Semites believe that Jews worship at. That's what I'm trying to prevent. When you have Matthew describing a story, the Gospel of Matthew describing a story that Pontius Pilate, who was a vicious anti Semite, he was recalled back to Rome. You can look this up. He was recalled back to Rome because he was so barbaric to Jews. You have Pontius Pilate literally washing his hands of the entire trial. He wanted no parts of it. Goes on to say that he finds Jesus innocent. But because the Jews wanted to kill Jesus, and there's a statement that says, "Kill Jesus, kill him, and let the blood be on us and our children." That's not something that Jews would ever say. But you can see the narrative, you can see the agenda. The Roman Empire is being absolved of any wrongdoing when we all know that it was a brutal empire. My hope in exposing these lies about Christianity is that anti Semitism would decrease. And my hope is that Christians find their way back to Judaism, or at least consider Judaism. Because it is a beautiful, wonderful nation. That's my goal. I don't want people to succumb to idol worship. And I don't want people to read certain things that have anti Semitic undertones in them. It's extremely important that we as Jews be a light unto the nations. We are the people of the book. And it's our job, our duty, to teach people. Zechariah, the prophet Zechariah, chapter 8, verse 23, states that in the time of the Mashiach, 10 people will grab firm hold of a Jew and say, "Let us go with you." Because now we know that God has always been with you. It's our job to teach and tell the truth in hopes that it will decrease anti Semitism, it will remove the conspiracy theories about Jews. That's what amazing prophets throughout history did. When you look at the prophet Jeremiah, he was killed trying to convince people that there were false Jewish prophets that was teaching something that was against God. And he was killed for it. Look at the prophet Isaiah. He was sawed in half by his grandson. When you speak the truth, when you dare to speak truth to a society, you're risking a lot. So ask yourself, is it better to side with society, the world, be accepted, but be against God? Or to side with God, as many prophets did, and have the world against you? Because any time you speak truth or you talk about law and order, you're not going to be liked. Christians spend millions of dollars trying to convert Jews. Millions of dollars. Because they know that it grants Christianity legitimacy. It grants it credibility if they can convert us. And my goal through this presentation is to do the opposite. And hopefully Christians will consider Judaism and understand that Jesus, if he was real, essentially became a figure, a symbol of Rome. The Roman Empire was teetering on collapse. And Paul, a Roman citizen, seen a way to bring his country, his empire, together by creating and taking this figure known as Jesus and making everyone unified around him. And they killed anyone that opposed what his viewpoints were. Paul, who never met Jesus personally, never walked with him, never ate with him. It was based off a vision that he said he had. Again, this year, I want to try to reach as many people as I possibly can to get them to consider Judaism. Because I personally believe that if the world had more Jews, especially more converts, it would be a better place. And we would be doing our job as being a light unto the nations. So, if you found this presentation helpful, informative, do me a huge favor and hit that like button. Do me an even greater favor and subscribe to my channel. I always appreciate all the support that I am given. Thank you all so much for tuning in to Blade Talk. Be good to yourselves, be good to others, and until the next presentation, you all take care.